Working on a Hoopty Simplicity Regent lawnmower today. We're going to be working on the Mower deck bearings. I don't typically work on lawnmowers, I like to work on cars. Let's look at my 2 cents on this subject. The free lawnmower, beware. I got it working and I engaged the PTO and this deck was really loud. I've already replaced the bearings on one side and we'll have to listen to the other side here. Now all of that may not be the bearings, some of it may be like the shield rubbing on dirt. But I did find a bearing that was failing over here. We'll listen to the completed side here. So I'll start ripping it apart now, and you could probably stick a block of wood in here somehow to brace this. But I got an impact, so I'm just going to zip off these nuts here. I'll also say at this point that this is a very easy job. These aren't even press bearings. I could have done both sides at once, but I like to do one side at a time so I can have a reference. So there's a nut, a couple washers, and this pulley. Got the blade here. There's a washer, and then there's a washer with a hex, then the blade. This, I guess, is called a bearing protector. You can see the whole spindle's coming out right now. Still hearing some noise in there, so probably a lot of the noise was coming from this bearing. Back over on this side, I should mention that this comes off. There's like a somewhat splined end sticking outwards. A couple notches that this pulley lines up in. I'm going to mark where this belt keeper goes right now so I remember when I put this back together. A couple Sharpie marks. I'm going to zip the 2 nuts off for that. This side has a spring on it. Just unhooks there. Let's put a little arrow to that stud. I could take the spindle out right now, but I want to see if we can do that on the bench. Here it is on the bench. I'll take that bearing keeper off. And I'll take the spindle out now. Gotta separate this thing. Now if you notice in here there's a foam gasket. In my opinion, totally unnecessary. Don't buy that. You can see this thing is chock full of grease. There's a spacer that kept the 2 bearings apart. Like I said, they're not pressed, they're just set in there and this spaces them. Here's a grease zerk. The owner's manual said, oh, give it a pump or 2 every now and then. Here's the bearing as found. If you look carefully, you'll notice that this is a piece of steel in here. This is actually called a shielded bearing. It's not a sealed bearing. So I'm just going to give it a little tap here. I suspect this bottom bearing would have the most wear. Actually feels better than the top. It's if there wasn't any noise that was coming from this top bearing. Here's the bearing from the other side, and that side is really making some noise. See if you can hear this. I'm going to a sealed bearing, so I'm not going to be greasing this anymore. I think that's ridiculous. You can see what that looks like. But anyway, listen to this. Once again. I think I'll also point out that there was 0 play in these bearings. So just doing the play check, I don't think it's going to tell you if you got a bearing failure starting to happen. These shielded bearings probably held out some dirt. Maybe a little grease got in there, I don't know. But the sealed bearing hopefully will keep some moisture out. Now I could have went to the local small engine store and said, hey, I got a Simplicity, blah blah blah, and they would have charged me an arm and a leg for another sealed bearing. But instead I went to the bearing store with these, and they got numbers on them. You gotta look real close. And he said, hey, do you want a shielded or sealed? And I said, well, give me a sealed. It was $2 more. These are $8, and these were 10. So we're doing this deck bearing replacement for 40 bucks on this thing. If you were to take the whole thing to a lawnmower store, I'm sure they would charge you at least $200. I am going to put a little RTV in here. I'll wire wheel these the face on this in case this thing ever gets washed. Maybe it'll help keep some out. I'm going to want to clean down in here very well so that bearing gets fully seated. And the same with in here. Here's a bearing protector. All this crap's got to get cleaned out of here. Otherwise it could potentially make noise on this. You can see it's kind of sticking on there. Here's the spindle. I'm going to wire wheel the whole thing. I will point out that there is a shim here. It's going to be important to get this face clean so your blade runs true. We'll get these threads cleaned up. While you got the spindle out, you can check to see how true it is on a flat surface. This one looks good enough. Everything's all cleaned up here, and wire wheeled this. Got our shim on here. The shim is directional. The bearing slide on there. I cleaned up in here really good where this bearing's going to go. Both of them just pushed right in by hand. So I believe the shaft goes this way. Spacer and top plate. There is an indexing hole in this top plate. So I'm just dry fitting this thing to make sure that it's not making noise. Looks like it's going to be pretty good. I'm just going to put some RTV around the perimeter here to try to prevent water intrusion. No foam gasket for you. Alright, spacer. And this top plate. I'm going to screw it in the lawnmower right now. Get this thing pinched together. I'm going to point out once again this bearing protector is cleaned on both sides because the blade rides on this thing. If there was dirt on there, you might get one of these numbers. If I cared about the Zerk, I would position it somewhere where I could get at it. I'm not worried about it though. Got my long bolt for that spring where it needs to be, the two for the keeper, the rest of them where they need to be. I'm going to send these guys home. Oh, it's a locking nut. I'm going to put this pulley spacer on now, but before I do that, I'm going to take the time to clean up this face because I want the pulley running as true as possible. So that only took a second. Pulley's pretty clean. I'm going to get indexed on these notches. I think I'm going to put the blade on quick so I can hold that when I tighten it. This blade needs to be cleaned up and sharpened and balanced before it's reinstalled. But I sharpened and cleaned the blade. I'm still waiting my balancer. Once it's clean, it's a good time to inspect it for cracks or fractures. Well, the MAG 1000 came in, and I'm going to include this in this video because it's important to balance the blades for the longevity of those deck bearings. You can do it on a nail, but depending how you place it on that nail, you might get mixed results. This thing has a really decent bearing in it, and spins really good. This rod here is for checking to see if your blade is bent. I'm going to have to mount it different, step it out from the wall. But you can see there's a certain distance there. And it's about the same there. Starting horizontally, how fast it drops tells you how far out of balance it is. So I take a little off here. I would say this blade's actually pretty close. And after you balance it horizontally, you're supposed to check it for vertical balance. Apparently this hole can be stamped off center sometimes. I think it got it in pretty good balance now. I noticed it depends how you put it on this thing. You gotta try to put it on the same way every time. We're good horizontal, let's try vertical. So what that's telling me is there's more weight on this side of the blade versus this side. Instructions say you're supposed to measure this distance and this distance. If it's within 20 thousandths, it's probably good enough to run. All surfaces cleaned. We've got our bearing protector and our blade. Got a hex washer. I guess I'll put a little anti-seize on there. I'm not a huge fan of this stuff. This is a grade 8 bolt. Should probably be using a new one. And then we've got a flat washer here. And this is a cupped washer, so it's directional. Get this thing now. Alright, here's our sound check. Oh, it's whisper quiet. Thanks for watching.